Hi, I'm Jim McCann, founder of 1-800-Flowers. We created this podcast to share the wonderful people we get to interact with, we get to meet, we get to know, and most importantly, get to learn from. So I invite you to join us on this journey here on the Celebrations Chatter podcast. It's an important occasion, at least it is for me today. That is, I was informed that this is the 100th podcast that we're recording today. And the team here suggested that we turn the tables a little bit and that I don't get to ask the questions. In fact, I turn it over to a very important guest of ours to be the questioner today. And that guest is Dr. George Everly. George is a friend and connected to us in many ways. At the very beginning of COVID, I read a piece that Dr. George wrote, I think it was in Psychology Today, and I just thought it was brilliant and captured the sentiment and the challenges, the emotional challenges of the day in those earliest days of COVID. And I wrote Dr. George a fan letter. And I said in that letter, geez, I hope we have occasion someday to connect. And Georgia wrote back and said that, geez, you'd like to connect sometime. And indeed we did. And what I've come to learn about you is that you are not only a good man, but you're an amazing man too. And you're the kind of fellow, and I think this summarizes what I've come to learn about you, George. You have a friend who's a psychiatrist who tells the story that you have other friends, and if they get interested in something, they might pursue it and learn about it. And when you get interested in something, you write a book about it. And to date, you've written 28 books. But the thing I find most amazing, and the thing I tell so many people about as a sign of and an example of what people can overcome, you didn't know it, but you were born dyslexic. And over the course of your life/educational career and professional career, you learned to rewire your brain. And that gives hope and inspiration to so many people. But it's the most important thing for me about you, George, is that over the course of these 4 years, we become friends. George, I'm so glad for COVID because it gave us an excuse to meet. And gave us an excuse at your suggestion that we work on a project together that'll be released later this year, which I'm very excited about. But George, welcome to the 100th podcast, and I'm going to sit back and put my feet up now.
Well, thank you, Jim. I think, Jim, most people know you as a successful entrepreneur. You took a single flower shop, turned it into $1 billion enterprise, 800 Flowers, and its affiliates. They may know you as a philanthropist as well. But what I'd like to talk about today is, Jim, the visionary. Maybe they don't know that part of you so much. A lot of visionaries bloviate. Some write about it, but you found a novel way to express and explore your visions. And you do that through the Celebrations Chatter podcast. This is your 100th, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
It seems to me that Celebrations is a lens through which you share with your audience what is and what can be. And that's what a visionary does. But you've done it through the eyes of a uniquely gifted and eclectic collection of guests. So what prompted you to put all this together?
It was a suggestion of other people. That is, at the very beginning of COVID, George, we weren't sure what to do in terms of communicating with our customers. We didn't think it was appropriate to send them emails saying, buy our stuff. We were in the throes of, oh my goodness, we had to be remote instantly. For those of our workers who could be remote, for those who couldn't, how do we keep them safe? How do we keep the wheels turning? Would anybody buy our products? Would we be in business for the rest of the week, the rest of the month? We didn't know. And so a young lady who was my chief of staff then, who you know, Meredith Weinberg, suggested, well, why don't you just write what you're saying to me? Why don't you just write it to our customers and share it with them? And I said, yeah, maybe I'll do that. And so we wrote a letter and we did it in a newsletter form and we sent it to our customers on a Sunday. We didn't try and sell anything. And through that, we got enormous feedback from our customers saying how refreshing it was, that we weren't trying to sell them anything, and that we seemed to be genuinely concerned with their well-being. And we were doing that for a couple of years when it dawned on us that so much of the work we were doing to write the Celebrations Pulse, our newsletter, was the same work we'd be doing if we got to record some of these conversations and share that too. And the recording of the conversations could allow us to go a lot deeper with people we really thought had something that we wanted to share with our community. And that's how the idea for the podcast came about. And frankly, it's an excuse for me to have conversations I would love to have had anyway, but now we get to record it and share it with all of our community.
I thank you for welcoming me into your professional family, Jim. In the time we've worked together, I've learned a little bit about you, and what struck me is you seem to be driven by two things at this point in your career. One is you love to learn, and one is you're all about building relationships. It sounds to me like you found the perfect way to do that. It seems like you've got not only your brains invested in this, Jim, but you got your heart in this as well. Did you ever think you'd reach 100 episodes?
So I wasn't thinking about how many we do. What we're thinking about all the time is, what can we do next? How can we make it more interesting? What is it our community would like to hear? And now that it's so much more of a two-way street, and we get to hear from our audience, from our community, what they'd like to hear more of, or what they really enjoyed, or what they got out of it, it's just terribly reinforcing. And I'll give you, for instance, Georgia, how it's changed my life. And that is, you were on one of our episodes about adult male relationships. How do men have friends, keep friends, develop friends? What do those relationships mean? And you were on with two other friends of mine. And what was really interesting to me is I had three good friends on with us for that discussion. You, Larry Zarin, and Dick Oletta. None of the three of you knew each other, but we quickly bonded because we tend to hang around with people we like who are of similar minds. When I meet people now, that episode comes up a lot. And people talk about it. So, hi, how are you? By the way, I got to tell you, I love that episode about adult male relationships. And it seemed to strike a chord. And I've had so many good and meaningful conversations which go beyond, hey, how are you? What's new in your life? Are the kids okay? And they'll skip all of that to get to what they want to talk about, which is the realization that they have to be mindful and deliberate about maintaining adult male relationships because it's so important to their mental health, to their psyche, to their all-around relationship roadmap.
You know, the table has been on a real micro level, a place to convene and share personal situations, personal feelings, personal emotions. George, what do you think about the effect on friendships? Forget about work and productivity and profitability. And what do you think the effect of friendships in this new popular virtual workplace culture versus all of us convening under the same roof every day?
We now are the most connected group of human beings the planet has ever seen. And yet we are the most interpersonally estranged. Why is that? This is not just George's conjecture. So the American Psychological Association routinely does surveys on the health of the nation, and especially the youth, and different generations. And as we take a look at Generation Z, those born 1996 and after, those most connected electronically, we find that they are the most alienated, the most disconnected emotionally, the most anxious, the most depressed, and somewhere in excess of 20% of them said they had no close friends. I would like to come back to something, though, because Jim, you had asked me about the factors, and proximity is critical. But apparently, Larry, the electronic proximity, which we think brings us close, apparently doesn't do the job, which I think is important.
On its own.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you pick the topics, Jim?
It's about the things we're interested, the things we think our community would be interested. More and more, it's what our community tells us they'd like to hear more about. And it also, we follow the publishing calendar to see what interesting books are coming out that would go against our themes, our threads, and that helps to fuel directionally and from a sequence point of view what we choose to talk about. When we first started the podcast, there was a young lady who wrote a book. Her name is Amanda Kloots, and she wrote a terribly impactful and emotional book about her life, her young life, and the fact that at the early days of COVID, her husband contracted COVID before they knew what it was. He was hospitalized, lost a leg, and eventually passed away. And it was so impactful. And she was such a wonderful person to meet and get to know. And what I took away from her story is the importance of attitude, and to see how attitude can so differently shape an individual's reaction to hardship or triumph really is a great, great lesson. We heard that loud and clear from Amanda early on. Having gone through the experience you just did with Nick, is there anything you would say to people about how they should express themselves to someone in their life who's in pain?
I think you just have to express yourself. I think you have to get it out. I really do. I think trauma will eat you alive if you keep it in. And what I've learned through writing this book, doing the audio book, dancing through this grief, and then now writing the screenplay, every time I express this story, it heals me in a new way. And it really takes weight off of that pain and that grief. And it's something I never expected it to do. And it is now my number one piece of advice. Write it down, find a group you can talk to, do therapy, any way you can to release that pain and suffering, because otherwise it'll just eat you alive. And if you keep it in, you feel like no one else understands, no one else knows the pain, no one else has gone through what you've gone through. And no one else has gone through your experience, but people have experienced grief. And the more you talk about it, you don't feel alone. You feel understood and carried along. So I would just say express it.
And what about what would you say to people about how should they express themselves to you, to their friend, to their relative, to their neighbor who's going through a horrific time? Can they make a mistake? Can they say the wrong thing? What helped you?
I think just people being their authentic selves, coming over and just being themselves, not trying to put on a veil of, oh, I'm sad too, even if they are. It was just, if you're a helper, help. If you're a baker, come over and bake. If you are a comedian, come over and tell me jokes. Just be who you are.
Sounds like she was one of your favorite guests. But before I ask you about some other favorite guests, tell me about the guest or the interview that shocked you or surprised you, or when you did the interview, you said, wow, I didn't see that one coming.
I did a podcast with Cynthia Covey Haller. Cynthia is the daughter of a man I had great respect for, Dr. Stephen Covey. She and her brother both are great writers and lecturers, and she wrote a book called Living Life in Crescendo. And I didn't expect to enjoy the book as much as I did, and I didn't expect to enjoy Cynthia as much as I do, and to come away with such a clean and thoughtful point of view that has helped me to think about how I spend my time today and in the future, as long as I have choices.
Live Life in Crescendo was my father's personal mission statement, the last 10 years of his life. And I think that was the case because he was speaking in his 60s and 70s, and people would come up to him and say, well, how long are you going to do this? Are you going to retire soon? And what are you going to keep speaking? And why do you keep going about doing this? And he was dumbfounded. He thought, why would I stop? I still have passion for these principles I'm teaching. I still feel there's a need. He felt that his main goal was to unleash greatness in every person. Every person's potential has such greatness. And so he decided the idea of Live Life for Crescendo I don't know if you're musical. Are you musical at all, Jim?
I can boogie.
That's good. That's a good skill. Well, we're not so much. My mom had a beautiful singing voice, but the sign that my dad chose, crescendo. If you've been to a concert, you know what a crescendo is, right?
Indeed we do.
It just builds in power and energy and majesty, and it just fills the arena wherever you are. It grows stronger. And the opposite sign is diminuendo, which means it slows in power and energy and strength and loudness, and it fades and it finally stops. And so
isn't that how most lives end in diminuendo?
Well, I think they would if you don't find meaning and purpose in your life as you age. And that's what a lot of people sometimes at the end of their life, if they don't engage, if they are retired from a job, and in our house, the R word was kind of a bad word, retirement, because my father said, you can retire from a job or career, but don't ever retire from making meaningful contributions in other people's lives. And so the idea that as you get older, in the older age, you actually have more to offer. You have more wisdom, more experience, more time, more money, more influence, more connections than ever before. So why not lend that to a worthy cause?
So let's talk about what you've learned from some of your guests. Let's start with David Brooks. What did you take away from David's interview?
Well, I have to confess that I was really looking forward to my conversation with David Brooks, George, because I'm a fan. I'm a fan of his intellect, his ability to express himself, his ability to take complex issues and take them apart and put them back together again. But the conversation we had about faith with David Brooks was very important to me. And it surprised me a little bit how we went down that journey.
I have a friend who is a beautiful writer. He's a poet at Yale named Christian Wyman. And he wrote an absolutely gorgeous book called My Bright Abyss, in which he talks about his own religious journey. And it was important for me to have someone who, frankly, is a little cerebral, because I'm a little that way, but also deeply spiritual and deeply humble about obedience. And in Chris's case, obedience to the cross. And I just, the way he experienced his faith, he puts it much more beautifully than I ever could. But it's so rewarding when you find somebody who experiences faith the way you do, which is everybody has their own version in my experience.
But language is the only tool we have available to us. I think it's the only tool to probe at these questions. It seems to me that with all that you've read on the subject and the journey you're going through, that if you keep probing at it, it just, you're reprogramming your mind to think differently, to be open to other concepts.
Yeah, and it's felt very useful to me to have people who could put things into words that I am feeling, but I haven't quite put into words. But then I will say, and this was, you can go back to when I was 13.
David, that's what we look for you to do.
Well, my favorite phrase about being a writer is I'm a beggar who tells other beggars where he found bread. So if I find something useful, I pass it along. But I will say, I went to this church school in New York called Grace Church School. If people know New York, it's by the Strand bookstore in Lower Manhattan. And it was beautiful. The architecture was beautiful. And it was Gothic. And I must say, when I was 13, my grandmother took me to Chartres Cathedral in France. And I didn't believe in God for all those decades, but I still found there was something in Chartres Cathedral that was just otherworldly. And I found that consistently with Gothic cathedrals. So that I think for some people, music talks to them about the deepest spiritual things. For me, architecture is very powerful, to be in a place that somehow feels sacred.
Yeah. Wow. So you just corrected me and answered my question. No, language isn't the only tool we have. It's music and it's architecture as well.
Yeah, or art. I think there are many ways to get into this. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
You showed how one-dimensional I am in my thinking and how it's so much better to be multidimensional in your thinking. And so there was so many things that came out of my discussion with him. And frankly, you and I have had the discussion about the role of faith. And you told a wonderful story about a friend of yours who's the ultimate pragmatist. He says, well, look, when I get up to the pearly gates,
Yeah. So I learned this from a friend who happens to be a chaplain. He said, well, I had someone come to me the other day and ask me about why I had faith. And he said, I reminded him of an old philosopher. Hundreds of years ago, someone approached this theologian philosopher and asked him the very same question. How can you have a faith? What proof do you have that there is a higher being? And he looked at him very pragmatically and he said, let's assume that whatever decision I make, I'm going to be wrong. So I can believe in a God that doesn't exist. What's the consequence? I'm disappointed, but not really, because I'm dead. He said, but the other mistake, the other error is not to believe in a God that has offered me forgiveness and eternal life. So the mistake is, in his terminology, eternal damnation. Which mistake do you want to make? The one of being disappointed, but you're not really disappointed because you're dead anyway, or the disappointment of watching other people go into something far better and you're excluded. So faith is that which allows you to accept the things you cannot understand. With faith, there are no questions. And that's important. With faith, there are no questions. There are just answers. They have yet to be revealed.
It's something we've chatted about on the podcast more than a few times, the whole question of faith. And it seems to me that people who have faith are more fortunate than people who don't. And when you meet someone like you or someone like David Brooks, and David Brooks was raised a Jew, converted to Catholicism. For a long time, he was pretty agnostic in between. And let's just call him a man of faith now, regardless of which religion it is. And that's how I feel about it. It doesn't much matter which religion it is. The basic tenets seem to be pretty much the same. And as I get older and wish I had more faith, and as I have some guilt about not bringing faith to my children as much as I probably should have, it seems to me that people who have faith are more fortunate because they have the answers, which is that they don't have the answers, and they can live comfortably with that.
But there's a certain security in knowing the answers do exist. They haven't been revealed to you yet.
Yep.
And they will be revealed, but not on your schedule. It's on someone else's schedule. Makes life a lot easier.
We put our heart into everything we do. We are farmers, bakers, florists, and makers who grow and create with a passion. Made with love at every step of the way. Because at the end of the day, we know you're sending more than a gift. 1-800-Flowers, share with love.
In 2014, if I remember correctly, Time magazine named Kerry Washington on its list of 100 most influential people. What did you learn from her?
The interview was great. She was wonderful to chat with. But what I admire about her is that, like so many successful people, George, that you and I know, it's not by accident. And she has been preparing for the next act throughout her life. And she wants to play an important role in business. She wants to be on the production side of the entertainment industry. And indeed, she has been. She has her own production company. She feels strongly about certain social issues that she's an advocate for, and will spend important and valuable hours of her life on those topics that are important to her. Her family is extremely important to her, and she keeps that very private. So what I learned from her is a plan really matters. Having balance in your life, taking advantage of the opportunities that come your way, and being deliberate about how you choose to spend your time and your effort, all of that matters. And being able to not only have a plan, but to dream big.
This isn't a tell-all, right? This isn't an exploitive document. This is really a way for me to share some things that in my family have been secrets, but to to share them in a way that remains sacred. You know, I think that there's a difference between
that's
what's
a tough
sacred.
balancing act.
Yeah, it
Because some people
is.
just, I want to get it out there. I want to share everything with my community. And you edit. You're a storyteller, but you edit.
That's right. And I think, you know, I was doing a Q&A the other day where somebody said, oh, I wish you told more of your love story with your husband, right? And
It was 10 years and you didn't know he existed.
I know. Well, lots of people knew he existed in his own right, but didn't know that we were sharing our lives. But, you know, I talk a lot more about my husband and my marriage in this book than I thought I would. There's a lot of sharing about that relationship, but there is a lot I don't share. And I'm not going to, because this book is a particular story about a particular part of my life. Just because I've written this book and all 3 of my children are mentioned in this book doesn't mean I'm going to now throw my kids on TikTok, which I'm not going to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome, much to their dismay. So I think it's important that no matter what we share in life, that we stay in the position of authorship of our lives. Like, a lot of me writing this book was me stepping into trying to be the lead character in the story of my life. When we do that, we remain the authors of how we communicate that story, right? And so I get to tell the story my way. My dad always jokes he's so supportive, but he also says, you know, it's not the book I would have written. And I say to him, that's right. Like, I want you to write your book.
I remember the statement made by Louis Pasteur. He said, chance favors the prepared mind.
Yes.
It sounds like she has mastered that particular art.
Indeed, she has.
You've really explored some interesting, wide range of topics, Jim, and hard topics, not softball, easy topics. You mentioned our podcast on male adult friendships, but you've also talked to people about depression, about fatherhood, about being vulnerable, about grief. These are things that are tough topics, especially for men. Tell me about some of those.
Well, it was just about a year ago that I was at an event in New York City, and they had a speaker. The speaker's name was Chuck Thues. And I was wondering why he was a speaker when he started, and then I realized why. He was just a very important and powerful messenger. And Chuck is a Canadian who played hockey. He wound up appropriately at the University of Miami to play hockey. And he was on the team, the varsity team, for 4 years and never saw a minute of play time until 2 games, I think it was, into his senior year. Had been cut from the team a few times and just kept coming back, working out during the summers, trying to get his sharpen his skills. And he played terrific when he got his moment and never sat again. And he went on to be a player of the year in his league, and then went on to play professionally. But what he didn't know is that one of the things that was plaguing him throughout his life was severe anxiety and depression. So much so that he couldn't play a game without vomiting into a garbage pail a couple of times before every game. And it seemed like he had it all going for him, but he didn't. He was suffering terribly from this depression, to the point where it got, he went home to Canada, was chatting with his mom and dad. And his mom gave him a name and a phone number on a piece of paper, and he stuck it in his pocket. She said, this is someone you need to call. And it was 2 or 3 years later when he pulled off the road and he was considering taking his own life. And for some reason, he stuck his hand in his pocket, and that note was still there. That he had put in there a couple of years ago. He just kept transferring it from pocket to pocket. And he called that number, and the woman answered, and he told her who he was. And she said, do you really want help? And he said, yes, I really want help. And this time he meant it. And that was the beginning of his journey back from the very, very edge. To see him share his story, to feel him share his story, was tremendously impactful on me and other people that we've introduced him to since having him on the podcast. And we've become friendly. And he's an amazing and wonderful man. And he's devoted his life to doing something good and giving back by going around and telling his story, sharing his stories, writing his book now. And I just think here's a guy who took pain and turned it into accomplishment, and now taking it further and turning it into purpose. And I just think to meet people like that, to bring his story to our community, I know that his story and his telling of it has helped many people.
What should your friends, what should your coaches have been advised to do to help Chuck and the other Chucks out?
I would just encourage the people that know that other people are suffering is to give them a safe space and let them know that it's okay, whatever it is they're dealing with, it's okay. Because the biggest thing that we do is we make it not okay. Even as a society to this day, Jim, we're still stigmatizing mental illness, that it's a bad thing, or, what could they be dealing with? I mean, I think of like Simone Biles, like you said, Carey Price for the Montreal Canadiens makes $10 million a year. And he didn't play at all this past season because he's working through some things. And people have said to me, what in the world could he be dealing with? How bad could his world be?
The stigma is still there and it's still real, huh?
It's still alive and well, unfortunately. But I think giving people a safe place to just be vulnerable and to open up and to share and just say, listen, I'm not going to judge you. Whatever you're going through, I want to help you, but you have to verbalize it. And you may not have the exact words, just talk and give them space to talk. And that's what I was given when I called, and that really saved my life.
That greatest generation ever, they didn't have psychologists or social workers or a therapist, and they just toughed it out and they pushed through it, Chuck. But now you're saying we shouldn't do that. What was the consequence of that greatest generation not being able to talk about these things and not being able to deal with it? It looks like, well, they just went on, it was fine, but maybe it wasn't.
Yeah, and I don't know that it was. I think, like, when I talked to my parents and learning a lot of the things that they went through, and my dad would tell you to this point, and my mom, I lost her in June, but she would share with me as well that they just suppressed all their feelings and they just kept pushing through. And they acknowledge now that probably wasn't the best thing to do, but that's all they knew how to do. And I think that's the beautiful thing as we see, and I'll use the word evolution, but the evolution of us as humans, we're starting to understand now that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay.
But the critics will say we're softening up, we're encouraging this kind of behavior. And you'd say?
I would say I don't really agree with that. I think what it's doing is it's making us more vulnerable, but it's making us stronger. And because I think the more that we can share who we are and what we're going through, just like you and I are having this conversation today, somebody somewhere will hear this. And they may say, and I'm not going to say they will, but they might say, wow, this guy played professional hockey and he's opening his heart like this. Maybe I can do it too.
Men don't like to be vulnerable.
Absolutely not.
Vulnerability means we're not in control anymore. And that's scary for people. One of the things that takes control away from us, perhaps the most, is loss. You interviewed David Kessler on Brief. Tell me about that.
Well, David's a gift. David is a man who has had terrible situations in his own life personally, and said, there's a lesson in here for me. I have to learn how to deal with this. And part of dealing with it is helping other people deal with it. And David has made himself an expert and just a source of useful knowledge around death and grieving and the whole sympathy environment. We've turned to David Kessler a few times now for his help in grappling with the subject of death and dying, and with coping with the rituals around that, the emotions that come with that, helping people who are going through the grieving process. And he's just a fountain of useful information. Just the fact that you can have a tough conversation like that and have someone who's so empathetic and understanding and has done his work to become so knowledgeable about that. Every time we interact with David and we share it with our community, there's an outpouring of people who tell us how much he's been helpful to them. You have a point of view about the term closure.
I don't believe in it. I don't ever want to close the door on my loved ones. You know, my mother's been dead for decades now. I remember her. I think about her. There's no closure. I think there's a modern media term, closure, that they want to put a neat button on every story and finish it. But that's not how real life works. Now, sometimes our friends want us to find closure, and what they mean is they want us to find peace.
Yes.
There is no day of closure, just like there is no day of acceptance. And, you know, we find a little acceptance when we make the funeral arrangements. We find a little acceptance when we go to the funeral. So there's so much around acceptance. And when we talk about this acceptance, there's also a reluctance that even I have felt in my own losses. I don't want to just accept that they died and be done. Our generation wants more. And I think what became the sixth stage that I wrote about in Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of grief, is this concept of meaning, that we can find meaning.
Pull that thread for us.
Yeah, when people hear meaning, they immediately go, there's no meaning in a horrible death. There's no meaning in a murder. There's no meaning in a death by cancer. And I go, of course not. Meaning is not in the death. Meaning is in us. It's what we do after. I'll give you an easy example right here and now. I teach people to name meaningful moments. Jim, you and I are talking. People are going to hear this. It's going to touch someone. It's going to help someone. That makes this a meaningful moment we're in. And the more meaningful moments we can find, and here's the part of it. You've mentioned your mom, I mentioned mine. When a loved one dies, part of us dies with them, but part of them lives on in us. So when people say, how do I find meaning? I would say, Jim, what part of your mother lives on in you? And can you nurture that part? I say that to myself all the time. How do we nurture the parts of our spouses, our siblings, our parents, our children, our families, friends that have died? How can we nurture those parts in us? And that's the meaning, my friend.
One of those times in my life where I felt like I should be more in control than I was, believe it or not, was being a father. You had an interview about fatherhood. Tell us about that.
His name is Justin Batt. Justin's in the publishing business, and he wrote a terrific book about 942 Saturdays. And what is that? Well, he times it from the time you have a baby, you have 900 plus Saturdays in your life before they turn 18 and they go off to college or on their own. And when you boil it down to the numbers, you realize you better not waste many of those. And he's made it Daddy Saturdays, and they plan it all the time. And he's done this for years and years with his kids. And I think he's a terrific father. He's very thoughtful, and he's changed how a lot of men think about their role as a father.
My dad was really good at a couple of things, but he wasn't great at everything. And I learned that I'm not great at a lot of things either. I'm not a handy guy. And so my kids would ask me to build things for Daddy Saturdays, and like, good luck. My obstacle courses would fall apart and it just wouldn't work out. And I realized that if I wanted to give my kids experiences and let them see and learn things that I'm not capable of, because I don't have expertise in them, it'd take me forever to learn them, or learning alongside my kids just wasn't an option, then I'd bring other guides into my kids' lives. And so I resolved to say, you know what, I'm going to let my kids be the hero of their own story. I'm going to serve as their guide, allowing them to experience success and failure on their own, guiding them through that process, and then bringing other male guides into their lives. And we've done some of the most epic things that I would never have been able to do on my own, because I have a lot of other men to come into my kids' lives, pour into them, and help them grow and develop.
My dad tried to do that too. He tried to introduce me to people who he thought highly of, who I thought I should know. And it wasn't many, but there half a dozen. And to this day, 100 years later, I still remember those encounters. And, what impressed me was if my dad was impressed by them, I certainly should be. And indeed, it was appropriate. You mentioned the word hero, Justin. Do we as dads too often try and be the hero and just the hero? And what's the downside of that?
There's a downside. And if you look at a lot of the books that are written, or even around Father's Day, right, it's like the hero coffee mugs and the t-shirts and all the things. And I just think that there's another model out there that's better. And the premise of being a hero works well for a Hallmark holiday, but it really doesn't serve itself in practicality of fatherhood. And here's why: because when you set yourself up as the hero, then it becomes about you and not about your kids. And the difference there is that when you position yourself as the guide rather than the hero, you allow your ego and your pride to drop. That allows other men to come into your kids' lives. But more importantly, when your kids get older, right now, when you're with your daughter, you're still dad, but you're that sage, you're that guide, right? Parenting adult children is way different than parenting children when they're in the home. And so when you position yourself as the guide early on, then it's more natural to assume that role as your kids get older. And I see a lot of parents that struggle mightily with parenting adult children. And it's because they position themselves as the hero instead of the guide. And when your kids get older, they don't need a hero anymore. You are their hero and you always will be. You're their dad, right? And so that guide and practicality serves them much better, even as a youth, but more importantly, as adults.
I'm always wondering, how do I get my kids, even though they're grown adults and have their own children now, I still think about them and now my grandkids. How can I expose them to the wonderful people that I get to meet and get them to learn what I get to learn from these people? And you're on that list, George. And so having you over the house for dinner, getting you to meet some of my kids was a big old check mark for me as a dad on my list. And there's another man who's no longer with us who is like that. His name was Zig Ziglar. And I was fortunate enough to be on a speaking tour with him. And I said, Zig, I'd love to have you over to the house for dinner. He goes, I'd love to do it. So we had him over to the house for dinner, and it was my wife and I, 3 kids, and Zig Ziglar. And I was so thrilled because my kids who swore they didn't listen to my tapes and Zig Ziglar are now sitting around the table with Mr. Ziglar, asking, tell me the story about this one. Tell me the story about that one, Mr. Ziglar. And that was one of those big check marks on my list of things to do as a dad, was to expose my kids to a wonderful man, a great thinker, and a great motivator. And so George Everly, Zig Ziglar, I got a few more boxes, but 2 big important ones checked off.
Well, you put me in great company. Thank you. Thank you for doing that, Jim. I want to change gears a little bit. The topic of disabilities is close to your heart. Tell me about that.
I'm the oldest of 5. My younger brother, Chris. I have 2 sisters and a middle brother named Kevin. Kevin was born developmentally disabled. My brother Kevin lives in a wonderful group home started by an agency started by a wonderful man. Walter Stockton has become a very close friend of ours. And so my brother lives well, but he came to us some years ago and said, your brother Kevin would be doing much better if I could find him a job in the community. And I can't find him a job, nor can I find it for the hundreds of other people like him that live in my group homes and in my agency. But I have an idea. Why don't you and Chris come to dinner and bring your checkbook? Tell the story about how this idea of yours became Smile Farms.
Well, I think it was our idea, but you and I had talked a number of years about how we could do something together. And with my farming background, I've always had a notion to horticulture and things like that. And I did some reading, I did some studying, and I noticed that in the old days they would call it horticulture for the handicapped, that it was beneficial to people, that people loved working with plants and that environment, which was a non-threatening environment where they could be successful. So I remember the phone call. I called you and I said, Jim, I have an idea. I said,
expensive idea.
I said, why don't we create, number one, we need employment for our guys, but they need to be trained. They need to learn how to do things. And I said, horticulture is a great way to do it. And doesn't horticulture sort of back right up to 1-800-Flowers? And I said to you, I know of this was a greenhouse center that was closed down and that we have access to that. Let's go take a look.
And you said, bring your checkbook.
Bring your checkbook, yes. And that was our first center, and it's still thriving today. I think that was, in early mid-90s maybe when we started it. That's our one location. We have 5 now with Smile Farms, and there are 30 people, including Kevin, who's king there.
Yeah.
And they go to work there every single day, and my staff calls that my happy place, because when I'm frustrated, whenever I'm on edge, I get down there and I spend an hour there and I'm fine for the rest of the day.
Put your hands in the dirt.
Yes, exactly. But it's very successful, and they love the fact that they produce product that ends up at Smile Farms and ends up on TV and ends up being sold in stores and
Restaurants.
every place.
You mentioned I am dyslexic. Apparently, don't grow out of it. I'm also ADD. My father told an interesting story when I finished my first doctoral training. He said, when you were in 10th grade, your guidance counselor came to me and said, Mr. Everly, take your son out of high school because he will certainly never graduate. And if he does graduate, he's certainly not going to go to college. And my dad said, well, I think we'll just stay the course. And I looked at him and I said, Dad, why did you not tell me until now? And he said, I didn't want it to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because dyslexia and ADD are sometimes genetically transmitted. I certainly had concerns about my children. The biggest challenge is not going to be if they inherit one of my uniquenesses, shall we say. The biggest challenge is convincing them that it's okay and they're not flawed and they can be whatever they want to be. And Jim, you have given people this opportunity to be the best they can be. And that's a wonderful gift you've given people. But you know, Jim, we're living in an interesting time. You mentioned that some of your podcasts talk about politics. Let's talk a little bit about world events. Let's talk a little bit of politics. Who comes to mind that you said, oh yeah, that I want to talk to this person and here's what I learned from?
It's recent, George. My response is of recent vintage. 5 or 6 years ago, I'm at a dinner and I sit next to someone I didn't know. And he was a very nice guy and we had a nice conversation. And I said, by the way, Andrew, what is it you do? And he said, oh, I'm a candidate for president. I said, oh, really? President of what? And he said, President of the United States. And he reaches into the pocket and gives me a card. And sure enough, it says Andrew Yang, candidate for president of the United States of America. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, really. And we had a nice conversation. He convinced me that it was true and that's what he was doing. And in my conversations with Andrew, it became apparent that he was smart and he had a bigger picture in mind and that this was a means to an end. And the end I learned with watching him through that and supporting him and cheering for him was that everybody can make a difference.
Here's one of the reasons I ran for mayor. Check it out. So 2020, I come off the trail. I still feel terrible about the direction of American politics. And I'm really hot, so I get a book deal. And Donald Trump.
What was that book called?
It's called, right. While I'm zooming all day for Joe Biden and Cash Leaf and a bunch of other things during 2020, not to traumatize us all to get us back there, but I dig into why I feel like our problems aren't getting solved, and I realize that our political system is not designed to solve them, in large part because of one Michael Porter and Catherine Gale Root in the politics industry. You've gotten to know Catherine quite well, right? Yeah. Catherine and I are now like comrades in arms. I guess then now I should talk a little bit about that thesis, which is the political parties are like businesses where they'll listen to incentives. Yeah. And unfortunately, their incentives are not to solve our problems and make our lives better. It's to win races, which means placating and pleasing the primary voters who tend to be the most extreme 10 or 11% of folks in districts, very ideological. And so you have our legislators getting pulled to the sides, which is why most of us look up and be like, wait, what are you guys talking about? Like, that's not what I care about. And that's the way their bread is buttered. The numbers I use is, what's the approval rating for Congress right now? 23%. Yeah, now it's even lower. It's like 15%. Wow. What's the re-election rate for incoming members? 95%. 94%, right? So if you're a business person, you think, wait a minute. Like, this doesn't compute. Yeah. The numbers are so out of whack because 90% of the districts are drawn to be either blue or red, Democrat or Republican. Most of you know,
It's not just Democrat or Republican, but extreme Republican or extreme Democrat.
Sure, because again, they're not listening to you. They're just listening to whoever's going to vote in the primary.
Who's going to vote and whoever's going to write a check.
Well, whoever wins the nomination of that party in that district is going to win.
Yes.
In 90% of the districts. So then if you imagine their incentives, it's not to, be reasonable. It's like, okay, I just got to get my party's nomination, and then everyone else doesn't matter. So Catherine Gannon Michael Porter laid this out in a book called The Politics Industry and said the only way to fix these is to fix the incentives. And the only way to fix the incentives is to get rid of the party primaries, make it so that all of us can vote for anyone, and use instant runoff or ranked choice voting to choose the winner so you can have more than two candidates and the winner has to get a majority. So I read their work in 2020 and was profoundly moved by it. I thought they're right.
Yeah.
Everything else we're doing is less high leverage than fixing our political system. And so I was trying to figure out what my next step was. And I realized that if I were to run for mayor of New York and win, then I was going to declare myself an independent after I took office the following year and said, hey guys, not only am I an independent, but I'm the charter member of a new political party, the Forward Party, that just wants to get stuff done and is not ideological and it isn't left or right. It's not left or right, it's forward.
Yeah.
So the master plan was become mayor of the biggest city in the country, inaugurate this new political party, and try and lift us out of this mess by saying we're going to get rid of the primaries, which you can do here in New York. But Bloomberg came this close to doing it. Get rid of the primaries, making so anyone can vote for anyone, and then adopt a more rational form of government. Now, I didn't win that race, but the book was already written and done. And so at the end of 2021, I came out being like, hey guys, we need an independent political movement that's going to try and cure the duopoly.
Jim, Celebrations Chatter has been and continues to be a wonderful way to have conversations. You've made that very clear in the time we spent together so far. And it's about what is, conversations about what is, conversations of what can be, the moments in life we can learn from and be inspired by and even grow from. And you've brought them all together in this wonderful podcast. How do you stay connected to the people you've met here, to the community? And I think the most important question for me is what's next for Jim?
For me, this isn't work. I get to learn about and then have conversations with some amazing people, yourself included, George, maybe most especially. And I get to know them. Some of them I've befriended, but I've gotten to know so many of these people. I get to bring them into my life in other ways and introduce them to other people in my life. I get to share their wisdom and their experiences with our community. I get to learn from that. I get to make sure my children listen to these and meet these people and learn from them. So for me, pinch me, baby. This is what I've always dreamt of being able to do. It's what I did before, only now I have the opportunity to record it. This whole podcast construct came about to just be able to take what I was doing anyway in my life and turn it into an exercise that's beneficial to me, my family, my coworkers, and our community. And so I'd end up by saying to you, how lucky am I? Things have come along so that my crescendo is getting louder every day.
So what's next for Jim?
What else can we do? So the whole idea of celebrations, Pulse, Celebrations Chatter, maybe the Celebrations media group. What else can we do? What other forms can we take this information and package it and make it available to more and more people? Longer form, shorter form, print, video, digital. I think, how do we maximize our efforts to reach more and more people and stimulate more and more worthwhile and thoughtful conversations? Because at the end of the day, it creates an opportunity and atmosphere where you have more, deeper, and better relationships.
Well, I would be certainly remiss if I did not mention our project that's coming out.
Oh, do we have a project?
Yeah.
It was 2 years ago, right around now. where I remember I was in Florida for a long weekend. It was right after Valentine's Day, and you and I were on the chatting on the phone, and you suggested that maybe we work on a project together. And George, I was so flattered that you'd want to work on this project with me. I can't tell you. I think the work we've done is really potentially beneficial to so many people. We worked hard on it. I learned so much. I even started recording our work sessions because I couldn't comprehend all I was learning from you in just a one listen. I needed to go back and listen to it again and again. So I'm just so thrilled that you suggested it. I'm so thrilled that we worked hard over the last couple of years to draw out of you the work that you've done in a lifetime, to be able to bring it to a new audience. I'm tickled and excited to be able to announce what we're doing in just a few months' time.
We did look at trying to bring together a lot of the things that we've talked about today, the wisdom of the past, the wisdom of the present, looking toward the future. Most people, I think, want to be a little better at something. And I've really enjoyed working with you because you're the ideal partner, Jim. You are someone that loves to learn. You're someone who understands the power of relationships. And when you put those things together with a quest to learn the secrets of the past that can guide the future, then that's a really nice mix. So I'm looking forward to the project as well coming out.
Well, George, you're a gift to me, to my family, to my friends, and our community here at Flowers and its celebrations. I've so enjoyed chatting with you. I always look forward to chatting with you because it's an opportunity for me to learn and to get to know you better. And the more I get to know you, which is quite well, the better I like you and the more I appreciate you. You're terrific. And more importantly, you become a good friend, and that's what I value most. Thanks for being so generous and not slapping me around too much today.
Congratulations, 100. And
thank you, Dr. George.
We'll look forward to the next 100, Jim.
All right. Thanks, Dr. George.
Go to 1-800-Flowers.com. Find the perfect gift.
And wow the people you love.
Wow. This is amazing. Whether you want to say happy birthday. So cute.
Or I love you.
I love you too. Thinking of you.
Wow.
Go to 1-800-Flowers.com. Celebrate the people you love.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I know I'll be sharing it forward. I hope you get to as well. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow me along on Twitter at Jim1800Flowers and on LinkedIn at Jim McCann. Hope to talk to you soon.